Introduced in this episode to all of the wives and their respective roles in the family. Janelle is the worker bee. She just loves.
So I'm open to plural marriage, but I don't know if there's really a lot of men who can actually pull it off.
They were watching a production, a carefully engineered, strategically edited, ratings optimized television narrative dressed up in the clothing of authenticity. The Browns didn't tell their story. TLC told a story using the Browns. And the difference between those two things is everything. If that hits differently than you expected, you are going to want to stay for every single minute of what comes next, because we are going all the way in. If you are new here, welcome to the SW Daily, the channel that doesn't just watch Sister Wives, we take it apart. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get into it. Let's start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of the Brown family, but the beginning of the deal. When TLC approached the Browns, the pitch was simple. Real life, real family, real polygamy. Let America see who you actually are. The Browns, who had spent years living in the shadows of a lifestyle that was not just misunderstood, but actively criminalized in their home state of Utah, saw an opportunity. Here was a national platform to humanize their family, to put real faces on a practice that most Americans had only seen sensationalized in news coverage or crime dramas. They thought they were getting a megaphone. What they actually signed was a contract that handed editorial control to a television network whose only real obligation was to its advertisers. And here is the thing about reality TV that the industry has always understood but rarely admits out loud. Reality television is not reality. It is reality footage edited into a narrative structure. 3 acts: rising tension, emotional climax, resolution, or deliberately no resolution to keep you coming back next week. The raw footage of a family's life gets run through a machine, and what comes out the other side is a story. And stories need conflict. Stories need villains and heroes and moments of crisis. Stories need you to feel something urgent enough to tune in next week instead of going to bed. The Browns signed up to be characters in a story they didn't get to write. They handed TLC the pen and trusted the network to tell the truth. That trust was almost immediately tested. The very first major narrative event of the entire series, the thing that launched season 1 into crisis mode, the thing that made viewers gasp and lean forward, was the Lehigh police investigation and the family's decision to leave Utah in what was framed as a dramatic, midnight, flee before they arrest us escape. The show presented it as a family on the run, danger, stakes, a polygamist family being hunted by the state. The reality? Utah prosecutors had already quietly decided they were not going to pursue charges against the Brown family. There was no imminent arrest. There was no ticking clock. The legal situation was real. An investigation had been opened, but the threat level that TLC attached to it was manufactured. The producers took a real but mild legal circumstance and reverse engineered it into a season-defining crisis. The family moved. That part was real. The must flee tonight or face consequences framing, that was television. And that moment, that very first major story beat, tells you everything you need to know about how the next 16 years are going to go. Because once a production team learns that a real event can be upgraded into a dramatic crisis without the audience pushing back, they don't stop doing it. They build a template. And TLC built one that they ran season after season with remarkable consistency. Here is how the template worked. Take something real that happened to the Brown family. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be emotionally loaded. A disagreement, a financial decision, a personal struggle, a relationship friction. Then amplify the stakes through editing. Add ominous music underneath conversations that were probably mundane. Cut to a confessional of someone saying something that, out of context, sounds like a relationship-ending revelation. Create an act break right before the resolution. Run a next week on Sister Wives teaser that makes the whole thing sound like a 5-alarm emergency. Then deliver the resolution in the following episode. Not too quickly because you need to fill runtime, and immediately seed the next crisis in the final 10 minutes. Rinse, repeat, 20 seasons. Real Grief became a season finale. Real Joy got 30 seconds of B-roll and soft piano music before the show pivoted back to whatever conflict was generating the most engagement. The moments that were genuinely moving, and there were genuinely moving moments in this family's story, were packaged and portioned out like content drops, timed to sweeps weeks and mid-season breaks. But it wasn't just about amplifying individual moments. TLC had a far more powerful tool at its disposal, and it's the one that took fans the longest to fully understand: timeline manipulation. The network controlled not just how events were presented, but when. What viewers saw in episode 4 of a given season may have happened months before episode 1 of that same season in real life. The emotional arc that felt like it was building organically over 12 episodes was assembled in an editing room long after the actual events had already resolved themselves. You were watching a reconstructed past, not an unfolding present. And nothing demonstrates this more starkly than what happened with Christine Brown's decision to leave Kody. Christine's actual separation from Kody, the real world moment she made up her mind and started the process of ending their spiritual marriage, happened months before viewers ever saw even the first hint of it on screen. In real life, that chapter was already written. Christine had already begun moving forward, and TLC sat on it. They held the biggest emotional storyline of the entire series and released it in carefully calculated pieces at a pace designed to extract maximum viewership over multiple seasons. Every conversation, every confessional, every moment of tension between Christine and Kody that aired during that period, the audience was watching a story the network had already finished assembling. They just hadn't shown you the ending yet, because the ending was worth too much to give away for free. Think about what that means. You watched Christine struggle. You watched her try. You watched what looked like real-time heartbreak and real-time decision-making. And the entire time, the network already knew how it ended. They already had the footage. They were just controlling the release schedule. That's not a documentary. It's a serialized drama with real people as the cast. Now, there is a point in the timeline of this show where the illusion starts breaking. Not behind the scenes, but right out in the open, in real time on social media. And it is fascinating to watch. TLC starts releasing dramatic teaser content before episodes, tweets, clips, promotional graphics. It feels like there's storms brewing in the family, that kind of thing. Big, ominous, designed to spike engagement before air dates. The problem is, increasingly, the actual episodes don't deliver on the drama the promos are promising. The storm never actually arrives. The bombshell turns out to be a moderate disagreement that gets resolved in 15 minutes. The jaw-dropping moment is something that, in context, barely registers. And the audience notices. Fans start talking openly on Twitter, on Reddit, on forums. The language shifts. Instead of discussing what happened in the episode, people start discussing what the episode was doing. They start naming the editing techniques. They start cataloging the mismatches between promotional material and actual content. They start building timelines and pointing out contradictions, moments where a confessional doesn't match the chronology of what was shown, or where footage from one event is clearly being used to illustrate a different event entirely. The r/Sister Wives community became something remarkable during this period. It transforms from a fan community into something closer to a media criticism community. People are posting detailed breakdowns of editing choices, comparing timestamps, cross-referencing interviews the family members gave outside the show against what the show claimed was happening at the same time. Fans who had spent years emotionally invested in this family started watching the show with a completely different eye. Not to follow the story, but to find the seams. And the seams were everywhere once you knew where to look. Confessionals that clearly referenced events that hadn't been shown yet, meaning they were filmed out of sequence and dropped into episodes where they didn't chronologically belong. B-roll footage recycled across multiple seasons to illustrate new scenes. Emotional music cues placed under conversations that, based on what the participants later described in outside interviews, were far more low-key than they appeared on screen. Storylines that were quietly dropped between seasons without acknowledgement, suggesting they either didn't resolve dramatically enough to be worth continuing, or that the reality of what happened contradicted the narrative the show had built around them. What makes all of this particularly pointed is the contracts. The Browns reportedly had contractual arrangements that gave TLC extensive narrative control. The network had final say over what aired, what didn't, when it aired, and how it was framed. Kody, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin were participants in the production, but they were not the authors of it. They couldn't look at a cut of an episode and demand changes the way a documentary subject with editorial approval rights might. They were inside a machine they had agreed to participate in, but they couldn't steer it. This is important because it changes how you read the Brown family's behavior over the years. Some of what looked like poor communication or emotional evasiveness or contradictory positions may have been exactly that. But some of it may also have been the result of people performing for cameras in a context they knew was going to be edited against them. When you know your worst moment is going to be captured and held until it can be deployed for maximum impact, it changes how you exist in front of a camera. It creates a layer of performance over everything that makes genuine authenticity almost impossible. And TLC, to be clear, was not subtle about what it was doing as the years went on. The one-on-one specials that aired during later seasons were supposed to give individual family members space to clarify and contextualize. What they actually did was give the network another controlled environment to shape the narrative, with critical context cut out, with follow-up questions that clearly steered subjects toward more dramatic answers, and with editing that made nuanced positions sound more absolute than they were. The tell-all episodes, which should have been opportunities for genuine transparency, became some of the most carefully orchestrated content in the entire franchise, with reveals timed to hit at exactly the moments of maximum audience investment. Multi-week storylines that should have been single episodes got stretched across 3, 4, 5 weeks of airtime to fill a season order. Conversations that covered the same ground repeatedly with slightly different framing each time because the network needed runtime and the actual story had run out of new material. By the middle seasons, hardcore viewers were watching with a dual consciousness, following the story on one level and watching the production mechanics on another. And TLC, instead of responding to the growing audience skepticism by pulling back on the manufactured drama, did the opposite. They leaned harder. The promotional materials got bigger. The teasers got more dramatic. The "this changes everything" framing in episode descriptions got more aggressive. As the actual content got thinner, because a family fracturing doesn't actually produce more dramatic content, it produces less as people stop engaging and pull back. The marketing infrastructure around it expanded to compensate. It is a pattern that anyone who studies media can recognize. When the content can't carry the audience on its own merits, you pump up the packaging. You sell the sizzle because the steak has gotten tough. And for a while, a long while, it worked because the audience genuinely cared about this family. The emotional investment was real, even if the framing was not. People had watched these kids grow up. They had watched this marriage system be tested and questioned from the inside by the very people living it. They had watched Mary's catfishing scandal and Christine's gradual awakening and Janelle's quiet endurance and Robin's complicated position as the newest and most controversial wife. And despite all the manipulation in the packaging, the underlying human reality was compelling enough to keep people coming back. But emotional investment has a limit, and trust, once it starts eroding, accelerates. The moment the audience stops believing what it's seeing is real, not the events, but the framing, the context, the emotional stakes, is the moment the show stops being appointment television and starts being something you watch out of habit or out of morbid curiosity or because you want to catalog what they're doing to the story this week. And that is where Sister Wives ended up. February 2nd, 2025. The original series concludes after 16 years and 20 seasons. By the time the finale aired, the conversation around the show had shifted almost entirely. The Reddit threads weren't primarily about what was happening in the Brown family's lives. They were about the production. They were about what TLC was still hiding, what was being withheld for a potential season 21, whether anything being shown could be trusted at face value. The audience that had built this show into a franchise had not left, but they had transformed. They were no longer the audience TLC had originally cultivated. They were a dissection community. The trust between the network and its viewers had been burned through slowly over years, through 1,000 small manipulations that individually might have been forgiven, but collectively added up to a fundamental dishonesty about what the show actually was. And the Brown family was left holding the consequences. Because here is the thing that gets lost in discussions about TLC and editing and narrative control. The Browns are real people. Whatever the network did with the footage, the events were real. The pain was real. Christine's decision to leave was real. The collapse of Kody's relationship with his older children was real. Mary's isolation was real. These things happened to actual human beings whose lives were being packaged and sold to an audience that was told it was watching reality. The Browns thought they were getting a platform to tell their story. They thought the cameras were a conduit between their family and the world. What they were actually doing was supplying raw material to a content machine that had its own agenda, its own financial incentives, and its own narrative needs. And those needs were never fully aligned with the truth of what was happening inside that family. They were never going to get to write the ending. The ending was always going to be whatever TLC decided would generate the most engagement in the final chapter of a 16-year arc. And now, with a potential season 21 still swirling in the rumor mill, the audience is responding with something that is genuinely new in the history of this franchise. Open, vocal skepticism about whether it should even happen. Not the skepticism of disinterested people who wandered away. The skepticism of deeply engaged fans who understand the mechanics of what was done to this story and aren't sure they want to watch it happen again. They've seen the template. They know how the machine works, and they're asking, for the first time with real collective weight, whether the machine deserves another 16 years of someone else's life. That is the question that Sister Wives leaves behind, and it is not a small one. Reality television as a format has always operated in the space between genuine documentation and manufactured narrative. Most viewers understand on some level that reality is a branding choice, not a production philosophy. But But Sister Wives pushed that ambiguity further than most shows because of what was at stake for its subjects. This wasn't people competing for a prize or spending a summer in a house. This was a family's actual life, their children, their marriages, their legal exposure, their religious identity, their private grief. TLC took all of that and ran it through a narrative machine. And for 16 years, the audience watched and trusted and invested. The lesson is not that reality television is bad. The lesson is that the word reality on a television package is a descriptor of the raw material, not a promise about the finished product. The footage is real. The story built from that footage serves the network. Always. And when the subjects of that story are real people with real lives and real consequences, the distance between those two things, reality footage and the story told with it, is not just an aesthetic question. It is an ethical one. The Browns gave TLC 16 years and 4 family structures and 20 seasons of human experience. In return, they got exposure, income, and a version of their story that was never fully their own. They handed someone else the pen, and in the end, someone else wrote whatever the ratings required. That's all for today on the SW Daily. If this one hit differently, if it made you see 16 years of this show in a new light, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear this conversation. Subscribe if you're not already here because we are just getting started pulling this story apart. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did TLC go too far? Are you watching season 21 if it comes? I want to know where you actually stand. See you in the next one.